Hi everyone and welcome back to Switch Up. Now there are some incredible first-person shooters on Switch. So that this video isn't about 9 years long, we're going to split this into a couple. This will be part 1 and it will feature all of the classic style first-person shooters, and then part 2 will follow after Christmas. Now you can save 10% on any of these games using code SWITCHUP over at switchup.gg to buy your eShop credit and it's delivered instantly. Or if you're a physical collector, you can save 5% on PlayAsia. All the links are in the description. I hope you've been enjoying the 12 days of Switch Up. We will be giving away the OLED based on those people most engaged in the comments. We've actually got 2 Nintendo Switch OLEDs to give away, thanks to a very generous donation from one of our subscribers. So, what are the best first-person games on Nintendo Switch? Well, let's find out. Quake Remastered was an excellent port for the Nintendo Switch, seeing fluid 60 frames per second gameplay, really nice gyroscopic controls, and it reminded us just how damn good the game design was just on classic Quake alone. They even went so far as to bringing in some of the maps that previously weren't in other versions, and this is an excellent way of playing Quake. Then we jump over to Turok 2. Now I'm going to skip Turok 1 because it still has a couple of performance issues on Switch, but number 2 is actually decent. If you're unfamiliar, it's a classic style first-person shooter featuring lots of dinosaurs and the dreaded fog of war, but thankfully it now runs at 60 FPS, has gyro, and it's a good fun blast if a little bit repetitive. If you're a dinosaur fan, then this will certainly be one that tickles your fancy. Over to the OG GOAT, it's Duke Nukem 3D. Hail to the king, baby, apparently. But it still holds up to this day. You'll start out on the top of that tower, trying to fight back against the aliens, but there was always something so meaty about the guns. Particularly even the first pistol and the shotgun, they're infinitely satisfying. Plus the fact that you didn't actually have to aim up to enemies, you just kind of aimed forwards in their direction and it still hit them. Really good, nice level design, and can actually get quite complex later on. Jumping from Duke to Ion Fury from the same developer, this saw a modern take on the exact same gameplay formula, featuring a female protagonist which upset a few people. I don't really know why, because it's a really good game, and it still features the dulcet tones of John St. John. A very good choice, and it scored very highly in our review here on the channel. Keeping on the same theme then, we've got Bulletstorm, the Duke edition, which is a 3D first-person shooter where you can combine the use of a whip to whip enemies into the air before you destroy them with a hail of bullets, but I was disappointed that this didn't have gyroscopic controls. Having said that, the gameplay still holds up and it is a linear first-person shooter, which for me is always preferable, and the storyline, while not the greatest, it does enough to keep those bullets flying for a reason. Now, Serious Sam doesn't need much introduction. It brought first-person shooters into a slightly unusual place and skewed the perspective as well as the ratio of size of enemies. You'd be fighting huge balls that run across the screen, kamikaze fellas with weird heads, and it was all about the pure shooting pleasure. Now the Switch version features a few of the games, although not all of them, it has to be said. I don't think it's got Serious Sam 4 on the cartridge, but still you're getting a decent bit of bang for your buck, no pun intended, and there's also split screen co-op, which is good fun. Powerslave Exhumed isn't one I've put a particularly long amount of time into. I've probably played the first level. It's decent, it reminds me a little bit of Hexen from back in the day, and it's very much a classic style first person shooter, you can probably tell from the visuals alone. Then, in the classic FPS, we have to have all of the Dooms. We've got 2016, Eternal, 1, 2, 64. There are more Dooms than you can shake a stick at, and they are brilliant games. Some lists would consist purely of Doom, and understandably so. The Switch versions all hold up really nicely. They use gyroscopic controls. I actually really enjoy the co-op mode in some of the earlier Dooms, but the more modern ones have actually transitioned surprisingly well over to the portable hardware, with the obvious caveats of lower resolution and slightly lower frame rates. Then there's Prodeus, which I've only played recently for the purposes essentially of adding it to this list, and it holds up really well on Nintendo Switch. It feels like a classic shooter, particularly when it comes to the art style. It's a hybrid. It's almost like they took that 2.5D style and made the 3D first-person shooter equivalent of it. Now it doesn't have flat sprites, but it's like a halfway house between modern and old, and I think it looks great. That's most noticeable in some of the lighting effects. Another then that I haven't put a great deal of time into is Project Warlock, but it needs a mention for its classic stylings, and I believe this was previously on another system, and again follows very much that classic style formula. Aspyr brought across a lot of the Star Wars games, but the first-person shooter Star Wars Republic Commando is notably a decent entry just in Star Wars games in general. Now when it launched it was in a sorry state and performance was a bit of a joke, especially on a game that's this old, but they have since patched it up. And while it's not flawless, it's much better than it was, and it's a really quite decent first-person shooter that had some ideas that were way ahead of its time, such as the squad commands and things like that. On to another oldie we've got on Switch, it's Oddworld Stranger's Wrath. Now this had some really strange guns in it and was very much a story-driven experience with boss fights and can actually be quite challenging, but it's good, it runs well on Switch. It didn't quite have the same charm that it once had in my opinion. There are a few clunky elements in terms of level design, but still certainly one that deserves its place on this list. Then we've got the excellent Wolfenstein 2, which is probably one of the best story-driven first-person shooters, featuring BJ Blazkowicz. It was a shame they went from this to create something that wasn't quite up to the same standard, but for me this is the peak of Wolfenstein on the Nintendo Switch, and is certainly one you should have in your first-person shooter collection if you're a fan of that genre. The more recent Bright Memory Infinite Gold edition shows what can be done on even the Nintendo Switch if you really put your heart to it. And I say heart and not mind because this is from a single developer who basically worked their arse off to create something that they knew was possible, not starting out on the Switch on other platforms, but they produced what looks like a AAA experience on a much lower budget. Now in fairness, it's much shorter than AAA, it'll only take you a few hours to complete, but it's still very impressive. There's some melee style first person combat. You can combine that with some decent boss fights, and yeah, it holds its own in a world of first-person shooters made by giant teams. Then there's the two Metro games on Switch. These are more story-oriented, but they run well, they have all my favourites, and they are quite scary if you're afraid of the dark. You can modify your weapons, which is a nice touch in the second one, add in silencers, and once you complete the game, there's what's known as Ranger Mode to add a much more challenging spin on the overall game design. These run at 30 frames per second, but it's pretty consistent, and visually they look quite nice. Which takes us on to all of the Bioshocks. We've got Bioshock 1, 2 and Bioshock Infinite, and for some perplexing reason none of them have gyroscopic control, which is their biggest downfall. If that doesn't bother you at all though, they run at a flawless 30 FPS. They are some of the best in terms of overall game design, mechanics such as having to hit them with a melee weapon and then shoot them to do much more damage are only a small part of what makes these games so enjoyable to play. It's really that storyline and the narration, as well as the characters and some boss style segments, that make this stand out as a series in the whole, and I cannot wait for the next Bioshock to release. The Crysis Remastered Trilogy takes us back to familiar ground with a more sandbox style first person shooter. This is generally split into arenas of sorts where there's large open areas where you'll be having to flick switches or kill a certain amount of enemies before you can progress. What separates it is the nanosuit that your character has, allowing them to do super punches, throw enemies across the screen, go invisible, and tweak the gun on the fly so you can add a silencer. If you pick up an enemy sniper rifle, you can customize it with a new scope. That was actually really good, and I don't think many first-person shooters have done that system better than it has been done here in Crysis, even to this day really. A few have copied it, but yeah, it works really nicely. Performance-wise, they run well, and yes, they have gyro, and for my money, they're some of the best looking that we have on the Switch. Now, Call of Juarez Gunslinger is a much more linear first-person shooter that tells a story of an old gunslinger who likes to tell tall tales. This is old school in terms of being very A to B, level based. It's certainly not a sandbox, and it thrives within that environment. It has all the quality of life things you'd hope on the Switch version. It runs well enough, although there are a few frame drops here and there, particularly on the levels with rain, and the way it handles cover isn't quite as fluid as I would have liked, but still for first person it works nicely, and if you're a fan of the Wild West, do not sleep on this one. If you like arena style first person shooters, then there's Boomerang X. I think this one might have slipped under a few radars, but we had a review here on the channel, and it takes this very unusual and quirky art style, comes from Devolver Digital as you'd expect from something that looks like this, and makes a very compelling first person arena shooter. There are a number of levels. It's not particularly long, which is probably again the biggest drawback, at around about 2 or 3 hours long, but still there's a lot of fun to be had here and certainly would make a nice little sales pickup. Hypercharge Unbox has been mentioned many times on the channel, and for good reason. It was made by a very small team. It features 4-player split screen co-op, but you can play completely solo, and look at it, it's essentially Toy Story meets Small Soldiers, and then throw in a few T-Rexes that are going to attack you and some really well designed stages within a normal house. Brings back those Honey I Shrunk the Kids memories and controls beautifully on the Switch despite not running at 60, but also they've added in lots of new features including bots that you can bring into play again. And it features one of the modes from Time Splitters 2 that I loved the most, where you can essentially have someone who is infected and then they go around trying to get everyone on their side. Another old one that's been brought forward is 13 or XIII. I really don't like the new art style here. I don't think it does justice at all really, because it doesn't run at 60 frames per second, whereas the old one would have done. And it doesn't look quite as stylized. It looks like they tried to make a modern version of an old game, but without very good artwork. Now that said, it's still quite a fun first-person shooter. There's actually some redeeming qualities here, and some cool little gadgets that you can use along your way. Feels like an old school 007 game really, and not GoldenEye. It's not as good as that, but it's still okay. And if you like the original, you'll probably have a good time. So that's it for the classic style first person shooters. To give you an idea of the next video, it's going to feature first person RPG and alternative first person shooters, things like Ghost Runner, Portal, Skyrim, The Outer Worlds, but also roguelite first person shooters like BPM, Severed Steel, Immortal Redneck, and then I think probably its own video will be the competitive, online and co-op first person shooters, such as Payday, Paladins, Overwatch 2, Borderlands, and even Earthfall, to name just a few. Hopefully you enjoy first person shooters as much as I do, and there are some fantastic ones on Switch. We also have a few more of these videos from previous years and months. I'll pop links to those in the description if you want to go check out those and see if there's anything else that you've missed. Let me know in the comments what your favourites are. Remember, we'll be giving away 2 Switch OLEDs in a couple of days, and all that's left to say is thanks so much for watching the channel this year. We really have had a blast, and as always, to our patrons, you're amazing, and our members, and for all things Switch all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!